on COVID and what you should and should not do, who do you trust?
On COVID, it seems to me the first point to make, if we're seeking to have a debate about public trust, how you build public trust here, is to recognise that we don't approach this subject in a vacuum. We approach it with 2 years of history. And what we've all learnt during that virtually 2 years is that there's been a tendency for the policymakers to put things off and to act late. And what it seems to me that public trust requires now is a willingness for an open discussion about the evidence on which decisions are made, in order that decisions as we go through this winter are based on the old principle that a democracy is government by explanation. It isn't enough just to tell people. You have to explain why you've made the decisions you have based on the evidence that's available to you at the time.
Absolutely brilliantly put. Government by explanation, and stop putting things off. But you've sat at that top table. You've been in cabinets and you have served this country with great distinction. And you know perfectly well that an elected minister, an elected government, has to balance the economic pressures with the science. And ultimately, they'll always make the economic call.
Well, I don't actually think it's quite as simple as that. It's not science on the one side and economics on the other. The reality is that both of those two elements, and actually there are other elements in a minister's decision-making process as well, around the social objectives that we have to try to ensure that the burden is fairly shared. And that we all clearly want to live in a society that is as free as possible. Those are all perfectly, I was going to say legitimate. Actually, they're vitally important considerations for a minister to have in mind. But going back to your the two sort of kingpins here of the science and the economics, as you put it, Alistair, both of those, neither of them can be said to be all on one side of the argument. Science, particularly in the evolution of this pandemic, there are different views in the scientific community. There are different views in the business community. Surely the mistake I think ministers make is to imagine that somehow science speaks with one voice and business speaks with one voice. That's not the case. We all know that there are different views among the scientists, among the economists, among all the people with other considerations. And that's why ministers, when they appear at a podium and say, science says X, undermine their own credibility, because science never says something with a single voice. What the government should be doing is recognising that there are multiple voices, provide a reasonably digestible version of those different points of view, and again, come back to the point, explain why the government reaches the judgment that it does on the evidence, and not pretend that it can't change its mind when the evidence changes, because that, again, undermines their own credibility.
Sure. Again, that explanation, absolutely crucial, Stephen. Looking back to the sources of that advice, I said in my overall introduction at 9 o'clock that you know, at 12 o'clock, it would snow me under. So you've got Cabinet, but you've also got Cobra. You've got SAGE, but you've also got Alternative SAGE. You've got NervTag, JCVI, and the NHS and Chief Scientific Advisors. I mean, is that how it has to be?
Well, I actually think that, the answer to your question is yes. It does have to be multiple sources because, go back to the point, science doesn't speak with one voice. And it's one of the things I think, it's one of the mistakes I think government has made right through this pandemic. It's better at it now than it was at the beginning, but it doesn't embrace this. It doesn't feel comfortable with the proposition. The principle, I think, is the principle I learnt during the BSE saga of many years ago, is that when a minister makes a decision based on scientific evidence, I always said the principle should be that it's independent advice given in public, so that the public can see the advice that ministers are getting. That's important, but there's another important point here as well. there will always be people in the official system who are giving advice to ministers, and there'll be people who are outside the official system but have the same level of scientific or particular expertise. And if the advice that's being given in public to ministers if they don't agree with it, it's important that that advice itself can be contested. There can be a public discussion. It's the Whitehall obsession that ministers must decide on the basis of advice given in secret. That's one of the things that I think makes it difficult for ministers to make judgments that are then accepted by the public. If the advice is public, and there is a public discussion about that, and ministers can then explain why they've made the decision against the background of that discussion among experts. That's how I think you achieve the objective, the core objective of government by explanation.
Sure. And final point flowing directly from that holds good if the Prime Minister or the Health Secretary is then a man or woman of such authority and stature that when they say A told me this, B told me that, I've decided on going down this course of line, that those people are totally credible. Have we got that at the moment with Boris Johnson and Sajid Javid?
Well, different people will have different views about how persuasive either Boris or Sajid are, but both of them have extensive support among the public, and their objective must be to build on that. So this is trust is something you earn. Nobody gives it to you. And if there was I was going to say slightly, I think actually, in truth, significantly different tone that was less, I know all the answers and you must do what I say, and more, this is the explanation, this is the evidence, these are difficult decisions, but this is why I've reached the conclusion that I have, and I will, of course, keep it under review. That's a different tone from the one ministers are currently adopting, and I think the great majority would find that much more persuasive.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows, and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.